Hello, everyone. It's notebook page 13, Behaviorism. Go ahead and take down the title card now. Let's start Unit 4. Let's get to Slide 1. So behaviorism was a movement inspired by the discovery of learned associations and behaviors, starting with Ivan Pavlov in the 1890s. Well, the likes of John Watson and others wouldn't codify and articulate behaviorism for several decades after that. Much of the groundwork was laid by Pavlov, who wasn't a psychologist but a scientist. Behaviorism believed that psychology should be an objective, data-driven scientific field, which most psychologists agree with, and that one should ignore internal processes that are happening. Any credible psychologist disagrees with the second claim, as cognitive psychology has clearly shown internal processes. We've studied the brain. That's important. Observational, somatic learning. These occur and impact one's thoughts and behaviors. While the behaviorists back then were certainly wrong about the second point, the first claim became kind of a foundational approach adopted by other fields of psychology to have that data-driven scientific field. Behaviorism's first major breakthrough was the discovery of associative learning, which is that certain events occur together. Associative learning means essentially animals and humans can be taught to anticipate certain consequences when consistently followed by a stimulus. So we'll get into that in a later slide. Let me put up the slide now. Try to slide down at this time. Let's move on. Slide 2. Classical conditioning. The first to make this connection was Ivan Pavlov with his dog salivation experiment. He essentially took the unconditioned, untaught stimulus, the food, and noted its relationship to the unconditioned response, salivation. A bell, which merits no response from the dog's unconditioned salivation, was considered a neutral stimulus. After feeding the dog several times immediately after the bell, Pavlov noted the previously neutral stimulus, the bell, had become a conditioned stimulus. The bell now caused the dog to salivate as the dog learned to anticipate food following the bell. Salivating now became a conditioned response to the hearing of the bell with that. These fundamental axioms of associative learning were further studied by John Watson, who coined the term behaviorism with his experiments on humans. We'll get into that in the next slide. Let me put this one up on classical conditioning, get that Pavlov experiment down now. All right, let's move on to slide 3, continue classical conditioning. So we actually talked about this John Watson experiment that he just wrote down, the Baby Albert experiment, when we talked about ethics. Watson trained an infant to fear, as shown by the infant crying, a white rat, by associating the sight or presence of the rat with a loud noise. The initially neutral, later conditioned stimulus was the sight of the white rat. The unconditioned stimulus was the loud noise. And the unconditioned and later conditioned response was the crying. So we actually looked at that at the ethical research. I may have also showed a video of those, which would show some of the associative behavior of that. So let me put up the slide here. You can take down what each of these terms mean. So there you go. And these are just the terms that you need to know that I want to get into. We've talked now about the Pavlovian experiment for a while. Here's kind of the setup for it if you want to take a look. But I think we've covered it pretty well in the notes and before the notes as well. Talk about operant conditioning. This was pioneered by B.F. Skinner. Operant conditioning linked learning and experience with behavior in a nuanced way. Skinner discovered that certain behaviors could either encourage or be encouraged or be discouraged based on consistently enforced consequences. Using his premise, he trained animals, most notably rats, to perform complex tasks such as activating levers to receive food, Skinner found that reinforcement, an event that strengthens the behavior behind it, can be used as a reward to encourage behavior in animals and humans. Skinner also found that punishment, an event that diminishes the behavior behind it with an adverse consequence, can be used to discourage undesired behaviors in animals and humans. Furthermore, he discovered that complex tasks or behaviors can be learned with shaping, a procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior toward closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. For example, Skinner trained rats to pull a lever with reinforcers, food, give them food, by rewarding them for closer and closer steps to the desired behavior, pulling the lever to the food. To do this, he would first reward the rat for going on the lever side of the cage, give them food. Once rats had made that association, he rewarded them for going near the lever with food. Once the rats had made that association, he rewarded them for brushing up against the lever. Once rats made that association, he rewarded them for touching the lever with their paws. Once rats made that association, he rewarded them for pulling the lever. Assistants had to intently watch the starved rats and reward them within 30 seconds of the desired behavior. The rat was unable to make the association. While it took incredibly large amounts of time and focus to do, he and his assistants successfully taught rat and the complex tasks of pulling a lever for food. Additionally, Skinner's assistants noted punishment could be used to discourage behavior, such as issuing of a timeout for a toddler who was screaming. Slide here. That more examples of all of these. All right. Reward. But there are also negative and positive categories for reinforcers and punishments. The negative or positive element does not indicate whether the practice is bad or good, but rather if something is being taken, negative, or if something is being given, positive. Now, positive reinforcement is giving the subject something it wants, food, for example. Negative reinforcement is taking away something the subject does not like or want, removing a collar or a leash from a dog, for example, could be negative reinforcement. Negative punishment is the withdrawal of a rewarding stimulus, taking away driving privileges from a 16-year-old, for example. Positive punishment is the administering of an aversive stimulus, giving a traffic or speeding ticket, for example. So we've used some of these examples in the past. I can have you write these down. That's what I just said. So you can write it down in your own words, what works for you. All right, let's move on to slide 6. So when attempting to encourage or discourage a particular behavior, there are various reinforcement schedules one can use to make the subjects more or less resistant to extinction. We talked about extinction before. The fading of desired behavior, the return of an undesired behavior is not consistently reinforced or punished. Let's go over a couple of these here, ultimately. So we're going to talk about stimuli. Discriminative stimuli is the stimulus that gets the reinforcer. If you're trying to teach your dog to roll over, that's the discriminative stimuli. What do you want them to do? And then you might give them a primary stimulus, which is something related to their biological needs that you want. So food is usually the best example, right? Dog rolls over, I give him food, we're creating that connection. And then a secondary stimulus might be what you give them when you can't give the primary. You know, for the dog, you might give them a good boy, good girl, right? You might give them a positive reinforcement speech-wise. That's a secondary stimulus. So let me put up the slide on this one. Let's move on to slide 7. So for slide 7, some of the other aspects which we may have talked about before. Acquisition is linking the neutral stimulus to create this, make it become a conditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov example, the bell was neutral, wasn't doing anything to the dog. Then the first time that bell equals salivation, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus and is connected to this conditioned response. That's acquisition. Eventually, that bell's not going to mean anything to the dogs, right? You keep bringing it, they don't get food, they're not going to salivate anymore. That's extinction. Just like the dinosaur picture up here, it goes away. This reaction to the conditioned stimulus, the bell, goes away. That bell becomes neutral again. But even after extinction, we can have what's called spontaneous recovery, that there can be times that it ultimately will come back. You might ring that bell a week later, and then the dog salivate again. You might ring the bell a year later, the dog salivate again. Spontaneous recovery. I'll put up the slide. All right, let's move on to slide 8. So some other aspects of this operant conditioning is generalization, right? That dog might salivate when it hears wind chimes. It's not the bell, but it's close. That's generalization. That neutral stimulus, that conditioned stimulus, might appear to be other things and still work. But things that aren't close, going to be discrimination. If I honk the car horn, the dog's probably not going to salivate. That's discrimination. It's not really that close. It's not going to take the place of that conditioned stimulus. Discrimination. And we can actually ramp up the learning here a bit. We can actually do what's called high order learning. We could associate a red light with the bell, which is associated with the food and the salivating, right? So once I link the bell to salivating, I can link a red light to the bell. Now when the dog sees the red light, they will salivate, right? We can keep this chain kind of going. It's high order learning. And honestly, a lot of these take practice. That's why we have the baseball player up there. You're learning how to be a good batter. You've never swung a bat before. You're going to start with bunting. You're going to start small and work your way up. Same thing with operant conditioning, in general. You want to get those rewards along the way to keep getting better. And this can work with behavior that way. So let me put up this slide. All right, let's move on to the last slide here, slide 9, reinforcement schedule. So, one piece to this is kind of the scheduling that I mentioned before of reinforcement. Ideally, you would have continuous reinforcement that reinforces a response every time the desired behavior occurs. So, giving a treat every time a dog rolls over, that's really going to work. That's going to make operant conditioning really work. You can't always do that, right? So we could do a fixed ratio reinforcement. That reinforces a response only after a specified number of times of that response, right? So, a good example of this is Starbucks, right? You go to Starbucks, you spend a certain amount of money, you get stars. After so many stars, you get a free drink. Now, that's fixed ratio reinforcement. They're saying, hey, after every, I don't even know how much it is, but every $50 you spend, $100 you spend, you get a free drink. That's fixed ratio reinforcement. Partial or intermittent reinforcement reinforces a response only part of the time. So sometimes you might get it, sometimes you might not. An example of this would be a salesman constantly making pitches to prospective clients, despite it only working a small percentage of the time. As long as it works, then that's fine, right? As long as it works, then it's fine. Or you have a variable ratio, which means that the ratio differs from time to time, right? You might get the reinforcement after once, you might get the reinforcement after 10 times. You're not sure, so you're going to keep doing it. And this is different schedules of putting that reinforcement in place. Let me put up the slide here. All right, that is the end of the notebook, page 13. Thanks so much. And this is the half of the notebook pages for this unit.